Hi.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second PTRC Fireside Chat. I'm really happy to see you this time. Thanks for sticking with us, even though we had some technical difficulties last time. Thanks to Glenn and our wonderful speakers for joining us for this event today. Just a quick introduction to PTRC for those of you who don't know us. We are a training company based in the UK, which specializes in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers, and placemakers. We're also part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, the membership organization for the professionals leading the movement of goods and people. We're very excited to have organized the second event. The first event attracted more than 1,200 people from around the world, highlighting, and we're excited to highlight this conversation on public transport, and we're looking forward to taking part of it. So thanks again for joining us, and back to Glenn.
Thank you very much, Brogan, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Glenn Lyons. I'm the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at the University of the West of England in Bristol in the UK, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing this PTRC event. And a very warm welcome to our international audience who've joined us today on the 18th of June for this live fireside chat. I'm told we've had several hundred people register from across the world. Do please, during the event, make use of the chat window on YouTube to share your views and raise questions you'd like our panel to address later on. And a warm welcome too if you're watching this later as a recording. Well, of course, COVID-19 is first and foremost a public health crisis, a time of intense difficulty and danger for us all. Risk of transmission and actions to address this have sent shockwaves through the transport system. And our first fireside event on the 23rd of April explored the pandemic's implications for transport. By then, a month after national lockdown declared by the Prime Minister, approaching 22,000 people in the UK had lost their lives to the virus, according to official figures. Today, 8 weeks later, we're gathered to consider the plight of public transport in the face of social distancing. The number of lost lives has nearly doubled. These are somber and volatile times affecting people's lives and livelihoods. We find ourselves in the remarkable position where public transport is seen to be a threat to public health. So what are the immediate as well as longer term implications for public transport of the pandemic? Well, I'm delighted to say that we have a highly experienced panel with us today to explore this, and they'll be introducing themselves in a few minutes when they offer their opening remarks. Now, you will see that our panel is white. Our efforts to create a more diverse panel were not successful, and we do acknowledge this. It may in part reflect challenges within the public transport industry itself. However, please be assured that we are very mindful of social inequality as an important theme within today's discussion. I should also say that as the public transport mode that supports most people in their daily lives, our attention will focus on bus services. I'd first like to set the scene a little, particularly in terms of the UK context. The nature of the pandemic is, of course, unprecedented. Scientists are able to offer advice, but not full understanding. Politicians must make and update judgments on how to guide, if not direct people and businesses on how to behave. Clarity of communication is essential and yet highly challenging. Transport operators are tasked with continuing to fulfill their legal obligations regarding health and safety of both their passengers and their staff in a radically altered environment, which itself is in a state of flux. They also need liquidity and to remain solvent as businesses. Passenger numbers have fallen dramatically in the face of the lockdown. While buses, especially in rural areas, are not known for always operating to capacity, the sight of ghost buses running empty has been eerie. Bus passenger numbers in Britain were maintaining a downward trend before COVID-19. Indeed, prior to the pandemic, just under 10% of trips by people in England were on public transport, with nearly 60% of those being by bus. Meanwhile, over 60% were by car. Bus travel then is a minority form of travel, but for those who depend upon it, it's critical to their daily lives. An evidence review from the Department for Transport last year noted that, and I quote, "People who depend more on the bus network for work tend to be lower paid and live in more deprived areas." According to the National Travel Survey data for the 5-year period 2014 to 2018, Black people in England are 4 times as likely to take a bus for a trip than white people. Meanwhile, Black people are a third less likely to use a car for a trip than white people. Bear those points in mind when considering that following new regulations from the 15th of June, the government's top-line message is now not only avoid public transport if possible, but also you must wear a face covering if you have to use public transport. Prior guidance on safer travel for passengers, published by the DfT on the 12th of May, had been that wearing of a face covering was optional, indicating that it may be marginally beneficial as a precautionary measure. A distinct stigma then is currently associated with public transport because of such messaging. Indeed, something noted by a recent report by the CILT itself. To quote an MIT paper that came out in April, New York City's multi-pronged subway system was a major disseminator, if not the principal transmission vehicle of coronavirus infection. Given the adverse portrayal of public transport in relation to social distancing, work by Professor Rachel Aldred at the University of Westminster suggests that as lockdown is eased, in an extreme negative scenario where former public transport commuters who have a car switch to using it, this could amount to up to 1 million more cars on the road in peak hour. According to the latest Transport Focus weekly omnibus survey of 2,000 people in Britain, almost half of respondents indicate that once restrictions are relaxed, they will drive more for journeys by car than they would have used public transport before. The proportion of people happy to use public transport when restrictions are relaxed remains at about 20%. Meanwhile, the figure is over 30% for Black and minority ethnic people. Happy, in part, I feel, may reflect willing and relate to whether or not people have a choice in whether and how to travel. Social inequality looms large. In May, the Transport Secretary announced the availability of £254 million to help protect and increase bus services, while pointing out that services may only run at 1/5 of their capacity due to social distancing rules. The challenge then now is not only surviving the financial fallout from the pandemic, but repositioning public transport as an essential part of the green recovery from COVID-19. An excellent US article published only 4 days ago stresses that, and I quote, alongside high visibility cleaning and strong health messaging campaigns, even more reassuring to people should be, and really take note of this next point, the lack of evidence that public transit systems have played a role in COVID-19 transmission, and a growing body of research pointing in the other direction. And just to give you one example, of 150 clusters of new coronavirus cases emerging in France between May the 9th and June the 3rd, none were found to be associated with public transport. It's clear then that there's an abundance of problems and challenges, more questions than answers, and yet answers are needed. Answers concern not only next week, how that will look, but also how the weeks and months of transition out of the pandemic could or should look, and indeed what the longer term prospect of bus use looks like. In its March 2020 publication, Decarbonizing Transport, Setting the Challenge, the Department for Transport is clear that, and I quote, public transport and active travel will be the natural choice for our daily activities. We will use our cars less and be able to rely on a convenient, cost-effective and coherent public transport network. So far from being the death knell for public transport, social distancing must be overcome in order that public transport is fighting fit to help deliver the future of mobility. So with those opening warmer remarks, I hope now I'd like to turn to our panel for this afternoon and invite them to give their introductory remarks also. So Nick, over to you to start us off, please.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm Nick Richardson and I work for global consultancy Mott MacDonald, having worked in both public and private sectors in transport planning and public transport over the past 30 years. I'm a director and trustee of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport and chair the Institute's Bus and Coach Policy Group. I write a fortnightly column in Passenger Transport magazine and have held a UK bus driving licence since I was a bus driver in the late 1980s. But today, as chair of PTRC, I welcome you to this session and hope that you find it useful and stimulating. As Glenn said, passenger transport is vital to the UK economy, environment and social cohesion. Without a reliable means of getting to work, the shops, education and a host of other purposes, we would be even more car dependent than we've been, with those people without access to a car becoming seriously disadvantaged. This has been acknowledged by government in recent years, with vast sums being spent on railway infrastructure and services, but comparatively small amounts for the bus and coach sector, despite the relatively high number of journeys and the vital role that they provide. While funding support has been made available, some services will have disappeared as a result of the pandemic. A return to school may not be accompanied by the return of the school bus. Bus services have a lot to offer in reducing vehicle emissions, providing access to work and training, and offering a high quality alternative to car use. But what's been lacking is the recognition that on its own, the opportunities presented by creating better bus and coach services will have limited impact, and that the wider context is critical. Managing car use remains a huge challenge. The arrival of the COVID-19 restraints instantly destroyed much of the demand for public transport use. As with many other businesses, having little or no revenue does not offset the fixed costs incurred. Incredibly, both the UK Prime Minister and Transport Secretary have been telling everyone not to use public transport. So the mountain to climb is to totally reverse that advice. This is fundamental if people are to be confident about using their local services and to ensure that buses can retain their markets and attract new users who are likely to be habitual car users. This will support local economies and address the inevitable spectre of traffic congestion and traffic-related pollution, given that buses are an important component of the package to address climate change. If bus and coach services are not restored and improved, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity will be lost as we return to the confused and contradictory transport policies of the past that we know do not deliver what the future needs. CILT has produced a paper covering these themes, which has been sent to government and others to help inform this debate, called Rebuilding the Bus Markets to Meet the Decarbonizing Challenge in a Post-COVID-19 World. This makes a number of key points, including the fact that the climate emergency has not gone away, that bus services still compete against a car-dependent population, and the popular perceptions of bus use, which have never been brilliant and are becoming entrenched. We also know that travel behaviour has changed and will change further in the future. We'll be hearing from the other panellists, after which I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I should say just briefly before I hand over to Catherine, Mark Nightingale has quite rightly pointed out that I'm not wearing a face covering on the bus I'm on. But actually that highlights another significant point, which is the clarity of communication, because the current government's guidance or intention is not that it will be increasing enforcement of mask wearing and conduct on public transport, but encouraging it. So whilst I'm not trying to be a rebel without a cause here, no one will be coming looking for me during the session, I hope. But anyway, enough of me. Catherine, please can we hand over to you?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and participating to this fireside chat. I am Catherine Chardon. I'm the Managing Director of the RITP Dev operations in London. We are one of the 10 group operating in London. And worldwide, RITP Group is one of the top 5 group in the world in terms of annual revenue. The group operates in 12 countries around the world and all modes. It goes from bikes to train, through boats, underground, buses, coaches, all over the world. So in London, we focus on of course, on buses. We have the 11% of the shares of the operations in London, and this is we've been here since 2011 on the London market. On my side, I've been working for RTP Group for the past 27 years, worked in HR, marketing, business development, and then leading our French business unit, but also North America, and I joined London 2 years ago. And my speech or my contribution to this discussion will be around, the risk that we now face for the future of transport and the risk that we have now. So, due to the COVID-19 is impacting the speed for change, in fact, in the public transport. For the past 5 years, there were new trends. The entire way people and goods are traveling have changed, with the introduction of car sharing, ride sharing, increasing viability of electric power, and also the growth of connected autonomous vehicles. These are strong trends, changes, introducing a new ecosystem of mobility that promises faster, cheaper, cleaner, safer, more efficient, and more customized travel. This is where we are. And just before the COVID-19, that's where we were. With the COVID-19, these questions are still very relevant, and the impact on the economy will have a great impact on public transport. As you can see, with 27 years of working in the public transport industry, I love my job, and I love buses, and I love trains. And the business model of public transport is really to go where the individual needs. So it's to meet the individual needs, but also to provide mass transit. Let's face reality: the economy, the business model is that we need customers and we need to have fares. That's why I am not an advocate of free travel. But it's another debate, not for today. So that's mainly. I don't want to say too much about the following part of the discussion, but for me, the uncertainty brought by the COVID-19 will impact what also happened since the past 5 to 10 years, with the change in needs and the change in usage. So there is a lot of uncertainty, as I said already, and there will be a shift in use, and that will impact our model. And honestly, if I may, but it's not to conclude, I am a bit worried, by the way, about that. So we'll share later on.
Thank you, Catherine. I thought you may have been about to tell us your glass was half full, but it sounds as though it may be half empty at this stage, which isn't surprising, frankly. And there's some interesting points there I'm sure we'll come back to, not least interesting question of whether or not public transport should be free, at least to the consumer, in order to kickstart what's desperately needed. But let's return to that. Thank you for that. Martin, I'd like to hand over to you now, please.
Thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Dean. I work for a company called Go Ahead. Go Ahead is a bus and rail operator. We run a lot of buses and trains in the United Kingdom, and we've also got some international operations. We run trains in Germany and Norway, and buses in the Republic of Ireland and Singapore. For my sins, I'm also chairman of the Confederation of Passenger Transport, which is the trade body in the UK for the bus and coach industry, and also non-exec chairman of Edinburgh Trams. I think there's not much that's been said by previous speakers I wouldn't disagree with. I mean, I think, as Glenn said, we've had an unprecedented public health crisis, and certainly we in Go Ahead, and I'm sure across the public transport industry, we recognise that, and that has to be said. And certainly think very much about colleagues that we've lost in the industry through that virus. But I think we need to move forward And we certainly believe there needs.
Martin, we temporarily lost you there. Let's hope it's temporary. I'll fill in just for a moment or two.
Go ahead, and I'm sure across the public transport industry.
Good, you're back. Martin, I'm afraid you're in and out in terms of audio visual. So what I'm going to do, if it's okay with Jane, I'm going to move across to you and we'll resume with Martin when he's hopefully back with us. Jane, I hope that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everybody. I'm Jane Cole, currently the Managing Director for Blackpool Transport. I'm one of 3 directors. A little bit about my history. I started in the railway, British Rail. That's where I got my stripes in the heavy rail industry, and moved into Virgin Trains in 1994 when the railways were privatised. Very fortunate to work as part of the Virgin Trains transformation team. And I left Virgin in 2014 to become the Managing Director of Blackpool Transport. I'm a graduate of Common Purpose, which means that, you know, I really do believe that the public, private and not-for-profit sectors should work together. And that stood me in good stead in my current role, because Blackpool Transport is a municipal bus company, which means that our major shareholder is the local authority, Blackpool Borough Council. So I've gained the trust of the council, and I've been very fortunate to be able to take Blackpool Transport through a 5-year transformation programme where Blackpool Council have invested nearly £16 million, £18 million if you take into consideration we also run a tramway, into really revitalising and reforming the way that transport operates in the town. So we've got a bus fleet now of nearly 100 buses, which has an average fleet year of 2.5 years, Euro 6 technology, so they're very, very clean. So that investment really, pre-COVID, was really coming into its own. An electric tramway, a Euro 6, an Enviro 6 bus fleet, and we'd actually revived the heritage tramway, the electric tramway. You know, that some of those vehicles go back to the 1900s. So the whole portfolio was, you know, leading up to becoming really transformational. And we're just due next year to complete a tramway extension up to Blackpool North Station, which means we're going to be connecting into the main train service as well. So really, when you think about, you know, where we are sort of now, COVID, we've gone from being a company where we employ 650 people at our peak. You know, we've got a big percentage of our staff now which are on furlough. We've got a very diverse workforce. You know, Blackpool is the gay capital of the North. We've got a big portfolio of BLGT employees. But when I look at BAME, you know, 98% of our employees are actually white. And obviously that issue will be talked about today, and I'd like to contribute to that. Our master plan going forward is that, you know, we've got a summer now not to look forward to. The portfolio of demographics for customers is that on the Fylde coast during the winter, we have 300,000 residents. When you look at what happens in June and the visitors start to arrive between June and November, we cater for 18 million visitors. So, you know, we go from 12 million bus journeys, 5 million tram journeys, down to just serving 300,000 residents during the winter. So to us, this is huge. We've built our assets and our portfolio around a thriving resort and modernised it to go forward. So COVID-19 now looks for us that, you know, we've been really just providing a key worker service. We've really been following round where the customers are. So our tramway closed the first week in April because we were minus 95% of our patronage. Our bus service went down to minus 82%. And we're just starting now to build that up again. And we're actually following customer demand around social distancing. So we are, you know, looking at the number of people that are starting to use us. We're putting social distancing in, and we're trying to run a very safe and concise service around the needs of the town. We're getting obviously support from government in a bus support grant, and we do get some of our concessionary fares back. But you're looking at a portfolio now where we will not be able to pay our dividend to our shareholder. We're having to defer loan repayments on our new assets, and we're lobbying the DfT now for money to restart the tramway. So if you think about what I've described over the last 5 years to where we are now, it really is going to be a challenge. But my glass is half full, and I see this as being a dip, and I'm looking forward to contributing about how we look at how we get out of this.
Thank you, Jane. I think that illustrated really well just how much energy and innovation was coming in to the bus sector before COVID-19, and so it's not just kind of rebuilding the passenger base, but recapturing that momentum and motivation in the face of what were already some difficult circumstances for the industry as a whole. Thank you. Now, Martin is back with us. Martin, did you have one or two things you'd like to bring back in? You've still got some time in terms of your introduction.
Great, thanks, Glenn. Sorry, everybody. I think I was cut off on my prime there, but story of my life. I was just about to say that I think we do need to start moving forward and changing the message on public transport. And I mentioned that in Go Ahead, we operate in Singapore, and it's interesting in Singapore. The message from the government is how to commute safely, rather than avoid or don't use public transport. And I think looking at it from the other end of the telescope like that is an interesting and probably a slightly more positive message, and I think that's what we need to start to get towards. In times of crisis, it's very, very true that people listen very, very carefully to what the government says, and that's quite right too. But I think that's obviously a challenge that we have. The government, because of the public health crisis that we've experienced, has been reluctant to suggest that people should use public transport. And I think once they feel that it's safe to encourage the wider community to use public transport again, what we would want to see is a balancing public information campaign, because the message has been so strong from the government, and we can argue about that message, but the point that I'm making is that because that is such a strong message in times of crisis, people will listen to that very, very carefully. And to balance that in the other direction, when the government does feel that it's time to say to people it's safe to use public transport, it needs to be made in a very, very strong way, to give the sector the kickstart that it needs. In terms of looking at the positives, one thing I would say is that it's quite clear that the commercial model at the moment is on hold. The bus commercial model is on hold while social distancing is in place. But it's been really good, I think, the way that the industry and transport authorities have worked together during the crisis. I mean, if you look at where we were at the beginning of March, nobody really appreciated the scale of the issue that there was going to be. But because of the direction from the government to lock down the economy for those vital public health reasons, we took a lot of our supply out very, very quickly in collaboration with the transport authorities that we work with, and now we're building it back up again very, very quickly. And I think there might be something to learn there about how we can work together as transport authorities and bus operators. I think this is something that Jane alluded to achieve the sort of outcomes that we want. Obviously, these are very, very short-term outcomes, but when we're looking at what we can do as bus operators and transport authorities to create the sort of societies and places and ways that we want people to move around. One of the things this crisis has shown is that we can react very, very quickly to the circumstances around that, and we should look to build on that. My last point is the 2 metre rule we have at the moment. There's a lot of talk about that being reduced to 1 metre. Certainly the hospitality industry is saying that 2 metres to 1 metre will make a really, really big difference. I think one of the things we need to get across in the public transport sector, and certainly bus, is that 2 metres to a strict 1 metre won't do that much for capacity. And that's because the seat pitch between seats on a standard bus is less than 1 metre. So a strict interpretation of 1 metre wouldn't increase capacity that much. What I would say is we need to take more of a risk-based approach. We've now got face coverings mandated in the UK on public transport. If you look at the way that most seats are configured on a bus or even a coach, They're all forward facing apart from the ones at the rear, so people aren't facing each other. And that should allow us to take a risk-based approach where we can really move down on the 2 meter requirement and even below 1 meter. And I would hope that we could start moving towards that. And the reason we need to do that is because, as a number of us have said already, we really want to take our role in driving the economy forward, building back the economy, and making sure that the contribution that we make to the economy is done in a sustainable way. There's lots of evidence at the moment that people are returning to our town and city centres, but because of all the issues around public transport, they're doing it by private car at the moment, and we need to make sure that we channel those movement needs into more sustainable modes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Martin. And I think you highlight very well the centrality and influence of government messaging, and of course the dynamics surrounding that, and the question of whether or not the science is following or leading is really quite critical. Heather, do please come in with your introductory remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn, and thank you also for inviting me to be on the panel. So my perspective is a little different. My background is spending a long time, about 17 years at UITP, which is the International Association of Public Transport, where I managed their Sustainable Development Charter and Diversity Initiative. And then I went on to Transport Research Laboratory in the UK. So I have the background very much of understanding the articulations between all the different actors in the transport ecosystem, between the authorities, the operators, the industry, and passenger needs, as well as a more research approach as well. And more recently, my work has been very much around the inequalities, social inequalities, with a focus on women. So I'll come back to that, because I think that has really a resonance now, which is very, very important to recognize. And up till now, it has been a little bit invisible. You know, we talk a lot about public transport and mobility and reduced mobility, but actually, you know, the success of transport is around how easy and freely we can move about. And unless you personally experienced problems, it really didn't have that same meaning. And now, really, everybody has had that mobility reduced to a level which they had never imagined was possible. So suddenly, reduced mobility has become reality for many more of us, almost all of us, in fact. And it was usually kind of graded on your economic ability to buy yourself out of this reduced mobility. And again, that has completely gone out of the window. So those have given us really completely new perspectives on how we should look at public transport generally, and public transport for a socially equitable society in particular. And no crisis affects everybody in the same way. And UK has an increasingly diverse population that is served by the public transport services that it now has. And so I would like to, excuse the pun, zoom in a little bit on the women's perspective of this, because women have been particularly affected by this COVID pandemic. And it's really accentuated the existing fault lines of inequalities in transport and other things, of course, as well. So just generally speaking, it's not so well known that women use buses more than rail services. Trams are somewhere in between, but particularly in terms of buses, they're about 64% of all bus trips are made by women in the UK. And in London, this is particularly pronounced because there are actually more women apparently in London than there are men. They also walk more, so about over 54% of all walking trips were made by women in the UK. So these two aspects also paint the picture, which is the reality that women are in lower paid, lower income and part-time jobs. and a lot of them in more precarious jobs. And those jobs have been particularly affected by the COVID pandemic. So we're talking about hairdressers, we're talking about all the events management, all those, you know, waitresses and pubs, restaurants, all that side. Very often that's women. And on the other side, all the caring, that's very predominantly women as well. So we have a real struggle to make sure that public transport, when it's built back better, it actually responds to the social inequities that were already there. So should it be free for everybody? I think there is a big debate about that. That has worked relatively well in small countries like Luxembourg and in a small city like Estonia, but I can't see that it will work in very large cities. But it does pose the question which Martin brought up about the funding. And I think that that will be something that has to be really looked at. And looking also about the responsibility of the transport sector to become more diverse. We've done really well to actually get, you know, 3 women on the panel here, and I really, you know, I'm pleased about that. But actually, the transport sector is very male dominated. It means that the data that is collected tends to look at the masculine perspective, what is important, speed, time savings. You're looking at commuter trips rather than care trips. So there has to be a shift in perspective when public transport comes back. And now is the time to really be able to do that so that you can get a more equitable transport services and systems and funding opportunities in place. So kind of as a last phrase, I'd like to say that we're definitely weathering this storm together, but we're not necessarily all in the same boat.
Okay, thank you, Heather. And thank you all for your introductions. As we knew, this topic, even though we've zoomed in from the total coverage of transport, it's just an enormity of issues to deal with. And I guess one of the points that came out in your introductory remarks was this issue of understanding the market, not just in terms of the scale of the market, but the makeup of the market, both in terms of people and the origins and destinations and timings that they'll be serving. And I just wondered, and this one of you welcome to jump in, I won't pick any individual, but how critical has it now become to understand the market even more than it was before COVID, and are we up to the job? I don't know whether Jane has.
Can I kick off on that one?
Yes, go on, Nick.
We're generally quite good at understanding what our customers want, but pretty hopeless on understanding what other people want. And this whole section of society is where potential growth is, and most of those people, like it or not, have some relationship with a car. So getting them to understand what their travel behavior is has never been easy, and now it's made doubly difficult.
And would one of our operators like to come in terms of this understanding of the market? Jane.
Yeah, I think that we've got an opportunity here, and I think that you know, the decarbonisation message is still very clear, I think, as far as government is concerned, and we will still have climate change. So I think that we've got to be able to be responsive to understanding that perhaps the car will not be king once we come out of this. The government clearly, from my point of view, has an agenda to look at how we can re-modernise the way that we look at the technology and mobility as a service. So I think there's an opportunity here for us, and for me in particular, a smaller operator that is in a local authority area, to say, how can we look at harnessing the demographics and the usage and what people need on the field, and combining that into a more responsive, more proactive network that gives better value for money all round. It reduces carbonisation, but it also fits the needs of people, because at this minute in time, it's a free-for-all, and that will get worse as people are told not to use public transport, but to use the car as king. But I think that, you know, anybody sleepwalking into this thinking that is going to be the future, that is wrong. We've got an opportunity here to de-risk ourselves as operators, to start working more locally on the needs of the local communities, the towns, the cities, and starting to look more rurally as well.
Would it be fair to say that pre-COVID, I mean, partly borne out by the figures, at least nationally, this notion, if one were being brutal, of graceful degradation in passenger numbers, but that the bus industry has been accused of providing routes and services for yesterday's demand rather than today's, or anticipating tomorrow's. And I'm sure that there's a variability in how operators would respond to that allegation. But it seems as though we're not just talking about a return of a level of demand over the next weeks and months. But for example, Martin Gallagher in our audience raises the question of season ticket structure. So if we've got a further 20% of people wanting to work flexibly who have the choice to do so, it disadvantages further the bus offer in terms of being price competitive. So is that something, I don't know whether Catherine or Martin want to come in on this, but in terms of how you're gearing up to having to be much more responsive to a changing market?
Yeah, may I jump in, Martin, before you? So, in fact, as I said, we are now, the trend is that everyone wants more customized travel, which means, in fact, our solution, which was the same from Monday to Friday, with the same type of service, doesn't now match with the needs, and we are all conscious of that. So as it is the way we have always done, but we know that it is changing. Young people don't have a car, but then they choose sometime an Uber, sometime a bike, and sometime our bus. And I think we have to imagine the future like that. It means the bus has to, of course, provide a service, but that will be used very differently from when we started 20 years ago or 30 years ago, our careers, when everybody was taking the same bus at the same time at the same bus stop every day. And this is over. This is definitely over. It means all our models have to change. And we have to think the bus as a complementary service to the rest. And as you said, Jane, this is mobility as a service. We cannot just think as the only provider of public transport, because transport is now the bike, walking, car sharing, everything like that. So definitely we have also to change our model. And that's a big issue for us, because we know that a bus needs to be filled with a certain amount of people to be economically viable. So that's also where the public funding, it becomes a real issue for the bus industry, and that can be also a discussion for later on.
So Catherine, just before I segue to Martin. Martin, you mentioned in your introductory remarks the commercial model of the bus industry is on hold, and effectively saying we're in the hands of government at the moment for our very survival. And I know Jane was mentioning this in our kind of pre-panel discussion, that there's the need for scenario planning, because it's not quite clear what next week or month will look like, let alone the longer term. So whilst I recognise what Catherine and Jane have said in terms of strategic thinking, when we come to next week and next month, or the next 6 months for that matter, and the very survival of the industry, I mean, dare I ask whether you have a view about whether it's a foregone conclusion the government will continue to support the industry because it has no choice, or are we in the territory where the very existence is under threat?
Well, I mean, I think we're grateful for the support that the government's given us, and we see it as a temporary measure. I mean, quite clearly, the reason I say it's on hold is because of the social distancing requirement. But I mean, I think bus is still a great product. There's a lot of really good things about it. Certainly, we're still getting really encouraging noises from government that they see bus as an integral part of meeting the movement needs of urban areas. And also, I would say, Glenn, don't forget the the commercial model that we have in the UK outside London incentivizes us to be market responsive. If you look since deregulation in 1986, been proved time and time again, the companies that are most successful are the ones that are the most market responsive, and that's because we take 100% revenue risk. So every additional passenger that we get, it goes to our bottom line. But I mean, that's a win-win for everybody, because if we get an additional passenger, it's because we're doing something right for the customer. So it's good for us in terms of our financial position, but it's also good for the customer. So I mean, I think we've got the tools in place to react to how things may change. We may find that some things go back to normal. We may find that some things change. But I mean, the one thing the industry has shown itself to be is very, very agile, very, very light touch, and able to react to shifting sands, and I'm confident we'll be able to do that. So there's definitely a future for the UK bus industry.
Okay, well that's good to hear as a start. A name that will be familiar immediately to several, if not all of you on the panel in our audience, Roger French, who's controversially suggesting, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, that perhaps the bus industry shouldn't be quite as compliant as it might be expected to be by government, given that the aviation sector isn't necessarily adhering so readily to strong guidance on mask wearing and social distancing and so on. Is there a challenge for how the bus industry does its own communication, both not to aggravate the government position, but actually to really give a positive message to both existing customers and prospective new customers? I don't know, Nick might like to start while our operators are gathering their thoughts.
Indeed. It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, for what's supposed to be a deregulated environment, everything about buses is regulated in some form. So there is limited leeway, unlike at the moment when a lot of those regulations have been suspended. And it's interesting how that can benefit customers. For example, two operators on the same section of route taking each other's return tickets. It's obvious, it's sensible. There are winners out of that and no losers. Why aren't we allowed to do it anyway? So I suppose with the current situation, it's a case of, do we actually throw people off the bus because they haven't got a mask on? Well, no, we don't. We all have to behave socially in a socially responsible way, and hopefully most people have got the common sense to see that. Okay, and would any of our operators like to respond, or Heather, for that matter, from a gender perspective?
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting to see how the systems that are working best are those that are, as Martin said, the ones that are most nimble and agile. And Jane also has said this. And this, I think, is really something that needs to be taken into account in terms of a push and pull kind of approach with the government. It's absolutely inconceivable that we should live without public transport. But public transport as it is today may need to shake itself up a little bit. We're not just talking about bus transport, we're talking about a way of mobility, a way of travel, and that has to interact with the mass and the mobility as a service, or the micro mobility options, in a way that it's not been comfortable to do so up till now. And there is a big gender aspect and gender and ethnic aspect in this, because women in general have less choice than men. That a lot of the e-scooting is all done by agile, able male, usually up to about 35 or 40, and they don't have to carry shopping or a 2-year-old, so that's easy. So, and they are also the prime profiles that men drive more than women. So in fact, in a way, looking at it through a gender lens, would provide opportunities for ensuring that bus travel remains, because bus travel is de facto, it has to be the choice of women for a number of different reasons. It's not to say that they don't drive or they don't use mass or anything else, but actually the core of bus patronage is very often a female patronage. We make more frequent short journeys than men do, and that suits bus scheduling as well.
Okay, thank you, Heather. What I'd like to do, yes, Martin.
So just very, very quickly, Glenn, to respond to Roger. I mean, I think the most important thing is that people feel safe. It's very, very important that people feel safe on public transport. And for that reason, we wouldn't like to outwardly go against the government message. It's much more important to work with government to get the message right. I've indicated we think we need to modify the message. But it's really, really important that people feel safe. So we wouldn't like to go against the government message for that reason.
Just on, before I move to some of the questions we received from the audience in advance of the event, just on that question of safety, clearly we have to work from where we are, but it seemed to me very telling, this recent article, which is raising a big question over whether in fact we have vilified public transport implicitly or explicitly regarding the health risks, without fully understanding whether indeed it's as culpable or potentially culpable as is the case in practice, with evidence suggesting, maybe not conclusive evidence, but suggesting to the contrary, that there are plenty of other settings in our daily lives that could be sources of spreading, transmitting the virus. Do you have a sense from any of your perspectives about whether that aspect needs closer examination urgently, with the prospect that that could help both the government and the industry, coming back to Martin's point, to take a much more positive and enabling position in including addressing the capacity question?
May I jump in?
Catherine and then Jane, yes.
So two comments on that. I think it's today more dangerous to go shopping in a supermarket than using one of our bus. And definitely the risk is higher over there. Not proven scientifically, but I'm almost sure that it is the case. And today in public transport, we have masks are mandatory. On the specific for London, I wanted to add that definitely we had some fatalities due to the COVID. The London buses lost 29 drivers due to the COVID-19. In my company, we lost 2 drivers. Definitely, where did they get the virus? Nobody will be able to say. But we are definitely protecting our drivers from in their cab. We are sealing the cabs, and today the scientific evidence show that with the cabs sealed the way we've modified with TfL, we definitely protect our drivers. And we also had the analysis of air circulation in the bus. Of course, the bus is a people get in, get out. There is a lot of air circulation. By the way, air circulation is the best way to get rid of the virus. So the more we open the doors and the windows, the better it is. But also it spreads the virus when it's so definitely standards have been raised now. Standards in terms of cleaning, antibacterial, we are really have been enhanced the standards, and now it's going to be the new standards. So when we talk about the new normal, I can tell you the new normal in the buses is now really much higher in terms of cleaning less. But of course, For me, one of the key thing is really to wear masks and to be able to use public transport without any limitation. But this is not yet done. I don't think it's going to be done before maybe July. I'm expecting the rules to be a bit eased, but it's not going to be done. So you know, a balanced point of view on that. It's not an easy answer.
Yeah, no, that's very, very encouraging, Catherine. I think there's kind of grounds for questioning there being certainly a kind of single view perspective on this, and actually it strikes me that dialogue with government, which I hope is going on, can really start to question some of the perhaps initial assumptions that were adverse, and which could be reversed and turned into a much more positive messaging for the industry. But Jane, you wanting to come as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that, you know, through this COVID virus, we don't know where, you know, the transport staff have picked this up from. And unfortunately in Blackpool, there's been no cases. We've not had any cases in Blackpool Transport. But I think from a brand perspective, you know, bus operators are really up there. You know, our employees now are key workers. I think the way that we've all gone out to make sure that we've sealed the cabs to keep our drivers safe, the way that we've put in-transit cleaning in, you know, we've put emotions at the centre of everything that we've done, from a perspective of making sure that we're communicating, we're looking after customers, we're looking after employees, we're tangibly providing things that we've never been asked to provide before. You know, we sell masks on the bus. And I think the way that, you know, clearly the message has come from government about, you know, you must wear a face covering. You should if you can, because, you know, that is everybody's personal responsibility. And I think that we can't expect our drivers to become medical experts in the way that they police people getting on and off. But what I've seen in Blackpool in the last week is it's been more about customers' perception of seeing customers on the bus without a mask and how they feel about that. So to me, it's, you know, if we've got a bus and it's got to be 2 meters, people sat side by side are less vulnerable than people sat face to face. So perhaps, you know, through medical advice, the government could relook at this and look at how we could get more people on the bus, but get them seated differently so that they're not in conflict of face to face or close proximity. But if they've got face coverings on and the way that they're sat could actually enhance, you know, government's thinking into getting more people on there. And I'd like to promote that.
Yeah, I think those points are very well made by both you and Catherine. In fact, someone in our audience has highlighted how the hospitality sector is pushing hard with government conversations in terms of the distance associated with social distancing, and raises the question as to whether the bus industry itself is lobbying and pushing hard enough to make its case felt and to bring about change. I'm conscious time as ever is moving on with us. We had quite a few questions that were submitted by people who'd registered for the event in advance, which the panel have had a chance to look through, and there really is an excellent array of questions. We won't be able to address all of them, but I'd asked our panelists in advance to pick out ones which they felt were particularly poignant or thought-provoking that they'd like to respond to. So with that in mind, Nick, I was going to come to you first and ask for your reactions.
Thank you. Chris Cole's raised an interesting question about the school bus. And again, it's something that's actually really important to people's lives, but which carries on in the background for most people. Social distancing and school transport. What we've seen so far regarding school reopenings has been something of a shambles. So it's very difficult to predict which kids will be going back when. But I think we can reasonably assume that there will be more children driven to school than there are at the moment in their safe bubble of a parent's car. Although children by nature are gregarious and don't like being in a bubble. So I think there will be, if say a school bus can accommodate half the number of kids it used to, I think that might well balance out over time. And then as more people get used to going back to school every day and indeed travelling on the bus or coach every day, that one will sort itself out in time. The only problem is, of course, that the school bus will get stuck in yet more traffic somewhere near the school. No, but that's one of those difficulties we'll have to deal with. The other big question, Peter White has quite rightly raised, is the whole question of this concept of peak time, which in many cases coincides with the school run anyway. And it's very difficult to predict what might happen because so many things we don't know. But let's just pause for a moment and think about the things we do know about. We know, for example, that the number of people working will be reduced. It's already happened in a lot of industries, and that's going to have an effect for some time. And often those industries such as retail and hospitality are the customers for public transport. So there could well be a direct hit there. The other thing that home working has shown is that people can be more flexible than 9 to 5 and going to a particular place. So can we spread the peak hour? Yes, I think we can. The other element of that is people not working every day of the week, and it may be different days of the week from one week to the next. That raises a number of issues. One is about ticketing. If you work part-time now, there's no point buying a season ticket for the bus or train because you're out of pocket. So you end up, in some cases, paying more than someone who travels every day. So no, there's things like that to accommodate. So changing work pattern. Also, in terms of the supply of jobs and the location of jobs, offices are extremely expensive. And no doubt lots of employers are sitting there scratching their heads at the moment, paying for offices that are empty. And will they want all the space they've rented or leased in a few months' time? They probably won't. So will you have a fixed location to go to? I think not. So no, there's potentially, and certainly in the short term, a reduction in peak demand, but also a spreading in demand, which I think we can help by working with big employers to see how that can best be managed.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And whilst I'm not going to leave it as a question because I want to move on to cover some of the other issues, it did strike me that whilst you've made some very compelling thoughts there, there's going to be a real challenge in how we spread the peak in terms of actively trying to spread it in a socially equitable way, so that key workers and those who are absolutely dependent on public transport are not being displaced by those who still have choice but are opting to come in during the peak as they've done previously. Okay, thank you. And Martin, I think we're going to come to you next.
Yeah, thanks again, Glenn. Had a couple of very insightful questions from Ian Coe, which are all about managing the transition as we start to move towards less infection rates and getting things back to normal. So one of the questions that Ian asked is how can the industry innovate its way out of this? And I think we've already shown some evidence of that. So, for example, in my company, Go Ahead, and I know we're not the only ones. We've been developing some apps which tell people when buses are full, the times of day that buses are busy and buses are less busy, and we've really introduced that with some supplier colleagues in lightning quick time. So I think there's a lot we can do in terms of real-time information messaging to help people so that while we have got this capacity issue on buses because of social distancing, people getting to the bus stop, give them a little bit more help in terms of real-time information about which buses are likely to be full in social distancing and which maybe more of a safe bet. And then I think the other question that Ian asked, which is an interesting one, is does the government accept the very large sums of ongoing revenue support will be needed for some considerable time? And what I'd like to preface that by was something that Glenn said initially about somebody asking about whether the industry is making sufficient representation to the Department for Transport. I mean, one thing I would say is that CPT, our trade body, with our member colleagues, has been very, very active, and we've been talking to the department all the way through this crisis about the sort of issues that are affecting us, how patronage is going, how things are going out there. And I think in terms of ongoing revenue support, as I said, the commercial model at the moment is on hold. It really does depend on social distancing. If we can get to a situation where social distancing is relaxed from the current 2 meters, reduced in some way or totally eliminated, then I think we can get back to doing all the things that we were doing before about encouraging people to use our bus and train services as well in a sustainable way. So I think there's plenty that we're ready to do, but there's absolutely no doubt there's a direct relationship between government funding support for the industry and social distancing. Until we can get over that issue, then I think we will have that requirement. But we're hoping it's not going to be too long. Certainly, infection rates are down. There's lots of much more positive news about how much infection there does seem to be around in the community. So I'm feeling positive about that.
Okay, thanks, Martin. And I won't dampen spirits by reminding us that one scenario is a second peak in terms of infections, which I'm not going to ask you to say whether or not you've been planning for that possibility, but I think it's still very much a plausible prospect for the immediate future. But
I mean, just a quick supplementary back to you. I think with tracking and tracing, I think as a society we'll be more ready for that. Would be my hope.
Yeah, I think you're right. The preparedness is there, and indeed, I think what we've heard through this session already so far is a sense that the industry really has geared up rapidly in terms of its understanding and its capabilities pre and during COVID, perhaps to be a champion if there is a second spike rather than so much a victim, perhaps. Okay, thank you. Jane, would you like to reflect on questions we'd had beforehand?
Yeah, so lots of people were asking about what the new normal of public transport is going to look like, and for me, it's about operators now being more entrepreneurial about the way that they get the confidence of passengers back. And one thing that we need to be aware of, as Nick alluded to, is the fact that the products that we have now will have to change. I think we need to do lots more customer engagement. For Blackpool Transport, we are now fully aware of who our key workers are and travel patterns for people getting to and from places that make the economy drive. So we're having to now relook at what we do from a corporate point of view to offer better deals so that people will continue to use the bus because we were providing that service up until now. And we're also aware as well that that work patterns will be a lot different. So things like more creative ticketing. We're looking at zoning so that we know that people that live within certain zones can travel more cheaply, but also looking to introduce extended ticketing, 24-hour tickets now. They're very popular because people have, later starts and earlier finishes and vice versa. So I think really, there's a big surge to look at your demographics now, to look at how your landscape is changing and to be reactive to that. And, that will then give us the opportunity to get confidence from government to say, we need some help, we need some subsidy, we need some investment for a short period of time so we can get this market back. And then the market will hopefully grow with the way that we lessen social distancing and by the way the car then does not become king.
Okay, thanks, Jane. And I was thinking, as you were talking now, I was thinking getting the market back versus getting the margins back. Do you see that without subsidy or without more subsidy, the sorts of innovations and flexible response to consumer demand is going to be challenging to deliver with achieving more margin as opposed to suppressing further the slim margins there already?
I think this is definitely going to be a marathon. I think we're probably looking at a 2-year, plan where we're trying to revive this market. It's not going to be quick, and we need to make sure that we're realistic. We're not going into this with our eyes closed, but people have to be aware that this will not be a short-term problem. This will be confidence. This will be recovery. And this will also be looking at new products and new ways of working along the way, which will take investment. Already I'm looking at a new ticketing system because I need to go contactless more quickly. I need to be able to package up my products now more than ever. So, there's going to have to be some investment along with the pain as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Jane. Catherine, can I come to you?
Yeah, I found what Jane fully agree with what Jane just said because it's going to be a marathon. We will go back to normal, but normal will never be as normal as before, which the reality is that all the articles and the studies show that even if we are very positive people, we like our job, and we really want to make sure buses stays in like a trendy mode. We need to also face the reality that we probably have a decrease of 20% of patronage. And that's what we read, and the analyses are showing that, because there is a growing reliance on e-commerce and home delivery. The new peak hour, and people are not going to work every day. We know that it is going to be definitely different. The other part of our, and this is, Lindsay Oxlade said, how can we continue with the 2-meter distancing? It cannot last too long. So the reality is that without public funding, we cannot last like that. The business model doesn't work. So that's a reality, and I think the government and DfT are very clear about that. They know that. And they know that they have to support public transport, and buses in particular. Why? Because buses are agile, can go where nobody else can go, and support. And I would support what Heather is really working on, which is how we make sure deprived areas have solutions of mobility. And this is the bus is the only solution. Which is the cheapest solution for everyone, and it has. There is a need for public funding for that. So that's for this question. And then Pete Dyson and INCO also ask questions about the future of mobility. So I may take that. For me, there are different scenarios. Of course, you say long marathon. I think there will be potentially a big shift depending on how we're going to balance between public sector and private sector. Between system-wide and individual outcomes, government-regulated or market-regulated situation. And the last thing, Martin, you talked about applications and data. We have also to have in mind that it is going to be a balance between data collection and aggregation versus privacy and security. How much our users or our customers will be happy to share with us or not, and we have to also think forward about that, because there will be some ethical issues, there will be some changes, because we need data to answer the needs, but people will also have the choice. So that's going to be for me. There are very different scenarios for the future. Very positive. I'm not negative, but we can have very different direction depending on public sector involvement or not for the future.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, very telling. You point to that perhaps indicative figure of 20% decline, but actually not necessarily seeing that as a signal of failure of the industry, but actually a reality where delivering an excellent service for 80% of the former market in terms of scale makes a very powerful contribution to a wider future of mobility. Having said that, I know you were taken by Pete Dyson's question, or he made the observation that there are lots of us, certainly those of us in the transport sector, who are really rooting for public transport. But we've also, many of us are armchair spectators to its demise. And I don't know whether you had a reaction to that, in this sense that there's so much support for the inherent, appeal of public transport, but it's not followed by being the solution people necessarily opt for because they have other choices quite legitimately.
Exactly. And that's why I think governments have also to take their responsibilities. You cannot say, I want to have a balance between London and north of England. You cannot say all that and just ignore the reality of the economy of the business. And Jane wants to reinvest in new ticketing system. These are capex, these are investments that are needed. Yeah, the answer cannot be just the private sector finding all the solutions. I am an advocate for public support, but rightly put at the right place, but it has to answer the needs of the areas where there's nothing. And when there's nothing, there's no bus, but there's not even an Uber as well, or there's not even a bike. So some areas there's nothing, and so we are the last people going there, maybe with the police.
Yeah.
so
and
this is where we play a role.
And this, obviously, I'm aware of one or two of the things that Heather wants to come back on, and I think you've brought us in some ways full circle to the social inequality issues at the very, very hard end for people whose lives depend on public transport or even are adversely affected by some of the circumstances. So Heather, what did you take? I know there were some related questions from our audience.
Yes, so I looked particularly as, should public transport, will public transport become again the transport of the poor? And I think this actually, the crisis gives us a fantastic opportunity to work very hard on the image of public transport, and particularly the image of buses, because we have seen in this pandemic that actually we are very social animals, and that we also definitely need to interact with each other. And that actually, at the end of the day, if you're hit by COVID, doesn't matter if you're at the top end of the social economic pile or at the bottom end of the social economic pile, you get hit by COVID and you can't buy your way out of it. So I think it has actually just opened the door a little bit for that discussion around the fact that actually we are all in this together. And let's look at the public space. People have really recognized how much public space has been given over to the car in areas where they could have been used in a different way. And people walking, I mean, in London, it's been absolutely stunning to see that they've taken road space away to make the sidewalks wider. If you had suggested this 5 years ago, you would have been shot. But it's really the way that governments are going to have to guide people to look at their mobility options in a different way, and maybe through zoning, maybe through looking at incentives and different funding mechanisms. But the central area of cities are going to become much more pedestrian friendly and car free. And so people are going to get used to taking the bus in the center of cities. And of course, that will change the image a little bit. And public transport has done a lot on that as well, but it needs to go a little bit further. It needs to show that it's really a modern, innovative mobility alternative that's part of that ecosystem, and kind of boost its old-fashioned image of being a little bit too rigid and scheduling on the kind of old approaches. And then just very briefly as well, should it therefore become free? Well, I don't think it can become free in the terms that we think of. You don't pay for it at all. You always have to pay for it. But the business model that will be used for particularly bus transport does need to be revisited. I mean, in England, it's one thing. In the US, it's a completely different thing. In Latin America, it's another thing. And there is an interaction with the private sector, but the public sector actually needs to recognize public transport is a public service. And it's a bit like providing water in people's homes. You need to be able to provide that so that everybody has that option. They may want it, they may take it, or they may not. That's up to them, but they should have that option. And so the funding has to be done in a different way, I think.
So, yeah, thanks for that, Heather. And I guess part of this is of course we need to see the survival of public transport as being a core public service, as you rightly say, but it also needs to be not just a service of last resort, but actually a service that really delivers a great experience for customers and for the diversity of customers. And it was very telling, I have to say, that when we were first planning this event, we were worrying about a health crisis. And we now have, well, it's not a new crisis, but the crisis of racism is alive and very, very striking for us around the world once again. And this moves into, once again, the social space, the public space, and how people experience their travel options if they have them. And I know, Jane, you had some interesting remarks from a Blackpool perspective, where perhaps in some respects you're not seeing diversity in quite the same ways that we might see in London, for example. But did you want to pick up there?
Yeah, just to, I mean, this has hit me between the eyes. You know, I take myself as being a good leader, a good employer. And, you know, obviously what's been going on behind the scenes is something that I've paid, you know, not as much attention to as I should have done, as I know now. So one of my, because 98% of our people are white, and we have a lady who works for us who called my attention, and she said, can I speak to you about this issue? And, you know, she's made me aware that, you know, we accept, the 98% of us, that this is okay, it's going on in the background, and she's fine. When you hear from her about how, you know, she moves around the organization and what she has to deal with and what she has to respond to, it's frightening. And I do realize now that as operators, not just for employees, but also for customers, we need to stand up to this. You know, the one thing that I used to deal with from a crime perspective was, you know, people being abusive towards, you know, people that were gay or, you know, BGLT. And to me, this is bigger. This is a lot bigger. So I think that, you know, there's a new perspective here that we've got to say that, you know, hate crime is something we've got to be aware of. We've got to be able to deal with it, but we've got to be able to deal with it properly and take the people who are being targeted as the centre of our thinking. So yes, there's more to do. It's only something that's, you know, I've really had to deal with recently, but I do think it's something that as transport operators now we need to look at, not just policy, but how we can overcome this. And
is that, whilst we've heard a lot about, in some respects, some of the protected characteristics and BAME included and LGBT are very much reflective and gender of the makeup of the core bus market. But coming back to the totality of challenges facing the sector, I mean, it's great to hear what you just said, Jane. Do you feel there's simply the capacity within the industry to really tackle this head on, whilst there's also the question of survival and responding to market demand, working with government and so on around that as well?
I think it's in the DNA of the industry. It has to be tackled. It has to be done in cooperation with everything else that's going on at the moment. It cannot be ignored, and it's happening now. So yes, it's something we need to be alive to, and we need to make sure that it becomes part of the overall experience, be it for a customer or an employee, and we do it now.
Yeah, thank you. Seeing other panelists nodding. Did anyone want to come in briefly on that? I'm also conscious of time, but point very well
not
made.
an easy question, but yeah, in London we are of course in a very different situation. A lot of our employees are, you know, from very diverse ethnical origins, but definitely it is still something we need to look at. I would like more women because it's a male industry. There are also, you know, people, BAME managers as well, because, you know, we have a lot of drivers, but we need also managers and directors. I mean, this is key, and it has to be a proactive and a decision made by the leadership. It doesn't happen without any action. So definitely it is in our hands to make this change. By the way, we are women, so we are very conscious about diversity, but we have also to go further with more diversity, and not only on gender, of course.
Yes, no, thank you, Catherine. as I knew would be the case, time has flown by, even though I know there are many questions we haven't picked up on. For example, a question from Mark Strong about, well, where will the public transport users have gone in the short term? Are they becoming walkers and cyclists, or are they home workers, or are they car drivers? And I guess there are questions, relatively speaking, about how easily it is to pull them back. Malcolm Reed makes the interesting point that actually you can't solve social distancing by putting people in the bubbles which are their cars. I think it was interesting, Nick was referring to bubbles in a very different way to the Prime Minister in terms of how we're dealing with these situations. As time is running out, what I'd really like to do is it's an impossible task, but to ask each of you, both in what you're experiencing in your day jobs around these critical issues, but also from what you've heard from each other today, what you would say is your takeaway message for yourself and for the audience. So just simply working by order of faces on the screen. Nick, would you like to have a first
Thanks,
comment?
Glenn. The whole current hiatus in many ways is an opportunity. And I'd be disappointed in some ways if we went back to what we had before, because here we are suggesting ways of improving the offer in difficult circumstances, but there is huge potential for buses and public transport widely. So now is a very good time to take stock of that, to think about improvements and to make those improvements in the next year or two while we recover.
Thank you. And Jane?
I think that we've proved today that we want to be part of the holistic approach that government is taking. And, I urge government to say, CPT, we will use you because, we know for a fact we've got the industrial strategy, we've got HS2 on the agenda, we've got the Northern Powerhouse. Let's make sure that, public transport, in particular the bus, is part of that. And we're part of that holistic approach.
Thank you. Martin?
Yeah, just two quick points, Glenn. One, to respond to Peter White, who made a very, very good point about flattening the peak, and which is something we haven't addressed. But I think it's worth just making that point because it's a really good point by Peter that there is potentially some opportunity if we do see the peaks reducing. Then there's a lot of waste in terms of assets and resource in the use of peak vehicles and peak trains for very, very short times of the day. So there could be an opportunity there. And just one final point, active travel. Heather made the point that this is really good. We want to see buses as part of active travel. There are some local authorities that are interpreting active travel as cycling and walking. And of course, if you make town and city centres pedestrian only rather than pedestrian priority, then that is a problem for bus access to those areas. So that's really, really important that we don't miss out on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Catherine?
Well, I'm not going to repeat the good final remarks from my colleagues, and I do really appreciate what we shared because it was very diverse, by the way. And I would like to finish by the something that Jane a little bit talked about. It's about the climate change and the decarbonization. The opportunity we have now is that we are part of that, and we are part of the solution. And there's no way we can fail on that. It is the future for us, and we'll be part of that. So that's for us a very positive future for the industry, for the buses, definitely.
That's nice to hear. Yes, thanks, Catherine. And Heather?
Yes, I mean, for me, it's been a fantastically interesting discussion for all the different perspectives and the questions. But certainly, it's really, this COVID pandemic has really accentuated the fault lines that were already there. And that provides us an opportunity to really build back better. And public transport has to do that in a way that it does come out better at the other end. And part of it, I mean, we're going to have go through an economic recovery of some kind. And it's always been said that public transport is part of that economic ecosystem as well. And we shouldn't lose sight of that because we've seen really in social equity terms, the value of a trip to somebody who has no other choice is really, really important. And that's a different perspective, which might resonate more now when we don't actually have quite as many choices, and not everybody has as many choices. And we have actually also been able to experience the value of walking and cycling more. So we're maybe open to a little bit of change in our mobility habits that would bring greater social equity.
Thank you, Heather. And just one or two remarks from my own perspective. I mean, I think the session has very strongly demonstrated, first of all, the weight of responsibility that is on the shoulders of public transport as a service that supports society and supports the diversity and the most needy in society. And I, perhaps picking up your fault lines point, Heather, the phrase "necessity is the mother of invention" really comes to mind, because I think there's also been some strong signals today about how this has been a further catalyst for being able to think and act differently and innovate within the industry. And I have to say, I've been very encouraged listening to all of your remarks about really how much the industry was already evolving. Yes, the national picture is one of gradual decline in bus passenger numbers, but that's not reflective of the way in which the industry itself has been improving and innovating, including partnerships of the sort that Jane has developed in Blackpool. And I guess it's absolutely fitting we should say in future, I'm pleased that, Catherine, your earlier remarks, it really is about strength through diversity. This is an opportunity to really change the mix in the industry, not because it's the right thing to do, that's true, but also because it's good for business to do that. So I look forward to seeing some half full glasses in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you all ever so much, and a little bit over time, I'm going to hand back to Brogan now. And thank you to our audience for staying the course and for such a lively set of questions I can see in my side chat bar. Thank you. Brogan.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Glenn, for great chairing as always. And thanks to our speakers. I think it was a fantastic conversation. The chat on YouTube was really blowing up. So thanks for that. We'll see you at some future events. I hope we have another one coming up in a couple of weeks, and I'll send out the information about that tomorrow. So thanks once again. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.